Hello, everybody. My name is David Bernstein. I'm the founder of the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values. I hope you all had a nice Passover if you celebrated. This is the Jewish Contrarians podcast, a podcast of the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values. And I'm delighted to be here with my partner in thought crime, Brandy Shafatinsky. Hi, Brandy.
Hey, David. Hi, everyone.
So today we're going to be dealing with another uncontroversial topic. Should diversity, equity, and inclusion programs in offices and bureaucracies at universities, public universities, be banned? Now, this, of course, emerges as so much of the hot issues in the culture wars from efforts being undertaken in Florida by Governor Ron DeSantis to, among other things, ban DEI offices and bureaucracies. And I want to take the issue seriously and sort of ask ourselves whether that's a good idea. So much of this is sort of gets wrapped into DeSantis' very aggressive campaign to end wokeness in society. And so it's viewed through that lens. But some of the things that he does might be completely legit. And I want to be able to ask ourselves those questions. And they may not be done by other states as well. So let's start with what happened last month at Stanford Law School. Judge Kyle Duncan, who's a Trump appointee to the federal court, was asked to speak by the Federalist Society at Stanford Law School. He was, of course, met with a hostile reception, so hostile that when he was actually going up to the podium to speak, one student yelled out, "I hope your daughter gets raped," or something to that effect. As soon as he starts speaking, of course, he gets heckled over and over again. He really can't even get through his remarks. It's very disruptive. And at that time, the assistant dean of diversity, equity, and inclusion for Stanford Law School, Kirian Steinbach, comes up and asks to speak. At first, Duncan doesn't really yield the floor to her, but then he realizes that he should do it. So he lets her get up to speak. And she proceeds to read from prepared remarks that she had and made this comment over and over again. Was the juice worth the squeeze? In other words, is his exercise of free speech worth the supposed harm that it did to the Stanford law students that were listening to him? And I love that phrase so much that I wanna put that on some of our merch when we get merch. You know, at the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, like the juice is worth the squeeze, kind of thing. And after the event is over, Stanford Law School apologizes to Judge Duncan for the disruption. And a few days later, the dean of Stanford Law, Jenny Martinez, wrote a 10-page defense of free speech and is now, I think, requiring a course for freshman students or incoming students. And they ended up suspending Dean Steinbach. So that obviously brought to the surface a lot of these issues about diversity, equity, inclusion that we've been talking about for so long, that it seemed to be reinforcing a culture that's inimical to free speech. And since this is a Jewish podcast, Jewish Contrarian podcast, it also raises concerns in the Jewish community and among some in the Jewish community like us that DEI offices are fueling anti-Semitism in many places. There was this Heritage Foundation study done by a scholar at Heritage named Jay Green. We had him on a live stream event, so you can see that on our YouTube channel. The study from a couple years ago looked at the Twitter feeds of 741 DEI personnel at 65 universities. And the report found that those DEI staff tweeted, retweeted, or liked almost 3 times as many as tweets about Israel as tweets about China. Of the tweets about Israel, 96% were critical, while 62% of the tweets about China were favorable. We've seen numerous DEI offices and universities engage in arguably discriminatory conduct toward Jewish students. Not too long ago at George Washington University, there was a series of incidents involving a diversity course that's mandated at George Washington. Stand With Us, the pro-Israel organization, filed a claim against Stanford, which suggested that Jewish and Israeli students in the program's mandatory diversity course were singled out for repeated and persistent harassment. Dr. Lara Shee, an assistant professor of psychology at George Washington, harangued Jewish students about their supposed power and privilege. She brought in virulently anti-Semitic guest speakers, including one who said that good deeds done by Jews and Israelis are done to mask sinister activity, and that the appropriate response to Israeli racism is violent resistance. When students complained to administrators, they were actually met with hostility and even retaliation, according to the brief filed by Stand With Us. So we have problems. And so the question, we're going to call the question, I guess, and I want to quote Peter Boghossian here. Dan, if you could put that up. Institutions cannot both have DEI and free speech. It's one or the other. Every proclamation to uphold free speech and open inquiry without dismantling DEI offices is a lie. Peter's a very impressive philosopher and defender of free speech. So I guess the question for us that we're going to have to struggle with, Brandy, I'm not sure if we're precisely on the same page, we shall see, is whether DEI offices should indeed be disbanded. But before that, I want to ask you, Brandy, what is DEI? Where did it come from?
All right. So diversity, equity, and inclusion, the idea of it actually came from the 1960s with the moves towards equal rights and towards affirmative action. So it actually didn't used to be called DEI. Most programs back then were referred to as D and I, so diversity and inclusion. And one of the things fueling those movements for diversity and inclusion was against workplaces that had been historically discriminatory against women and ethnic minorities at the time. What they've transformed into now seem to be something, and we can have a conversation on whether, advancing affirmative action and equal rights and civil rights through diversity programs is a valid thing to do at the time and whether it's valid to continue. But the bigger thing I think to look at is to look at how DEI itself as a system has transformed from advancing equal rights to perhaps actually limiting them in ways that you mentioned, where it actually limits equal rights to free speech and inclusion of speech that may go against the norm in a certain environment, like on a university campus, which I think is what we saw with the Stanford example. And I argue that is also something we see in mandatory DEI training.
So let's take apart the term for a second, the acronym. What is diversity? What is equity? And what is inclusion? Right.
Well, it depends on who you ask. So unfortunately, I think what we see a lot is when people are talking about diversity in terms of the DEI space, what we're seeing in the normal traditional DEI space, we're seeing people talk about diversity in terms of really just color. They're looking at, and a lot of it is based on stereotypes about what people of a certain race or color should believe, and those voices should be included. And that kind of skips over the E real quick and goes to the I about inclusion. Who were actually included in a lot of DEI programs? You scratch under the surface and find that they're actually a little bit more exclusive than inclusive, because voices and opinions that go against the orthodoxy aren't included; they're canceled. Which again was the case of the judge who was invited to speak at Stanford.
Right. So their definition of inclusion does not include viewpoint inclusion.
Definitely not. It doesn't include a lot of inclusion or diversity for that point. But the E actually used to stand for equality. It's transformed into this idea of equity. And when we've looked and when I've looked at what people mean by equity, they're really focused on equity and outcomes, not equality or equity and access. And those are two very different concepts.
Right. We've also heard other initials like JEDI, Justice, Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, or I've heard DEIJ as well. What do they mean by justice?
Again, I think that how it's used now, justice is in terms of ideas about racial justice and social justice. I mean, there's also a B added, belonging. So you'll see.
What's that?
Where everyone should feel that they belong in whatever space that institution holds.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah.
And everyone, I want to say that it's not really everyone. It's everyone who subscribes to a certain ideology.
Right. Now, there's been years of research done on the efficacy of DEI. Frank Dobbin from Harvard has done a number of studies. I've read work by Musa Al-Garbi, who is a scholar as well, who's looked at DEI research and concluded that it hasn't worked at all. Jesse Singal wrote a recent piece in the New York Times arguing also that when you look at all the research, it just doesn't add up. It doesn't add up. It doesn't show that there's any success at all in achieving the aims that DEI supposedly sets out to do. So you wonder why it's continuing to be done if it's so ineffective. I mean, do you have any thoughts on that? Like, why do we continue to do it?
I mean, I think a lot of people feel good that they're part of something that seems to be a popular movement at the time. But I also argue that I don't think that there are clear goals to, unfortunately, most DEI programs. There aren't clear measurable goals to what the end result will be, other than we're going to make this institution or this school or this university an anti-racist school. That's not a real clear measurable goal to then test whether that program achieved that goal, which is one of the main issues I have with current DEI programs. And so I got a recent email from someone, and it is about an educator at MIT who was talking about one of the first steps to actually addressing the DEI bureaucracy that seems to have taken a hold of a lot of schools, universities, and institutions is to insist that they do a financial audit and a performance review. And I think that for any program, especially programs that are costing universities and corporations and institutions tens of millions of dollars, you'd want to be asking them to conduct a performance review should be pretty standard. And I can't say that has happened, unfortunately, for most DEI programs. They seem to just be able to put forth whatever programming they want with no review of whether it works, whether it's causing harm, what are the intended consequences of that program.
Yeah. We also see some really ideologically crazy versions of DEI out there. And I think the closer you are to the university, the more likely that they're going to find fertile ground. So, for example, this idea of white supremacy culture, which is Tima Okun's formulation, that all American culture is, or most American culture actually, or what we consider the dominant culture, actually is an example of white supremacy. It's an expression of white supremacy inherently. Ideas like being on time or perfectionism or what have you is a expression of white supremacy culture. Now, I don't know how prevalent that is at at hedge funds or whatever, where they're doing DEI. I suspect not very, but I would imagine that if you looked at a lot of universities and you were in the room, not just what their material said, but you were in the room, you would see a lot of that in there. What do you think?
There is a lot of that where certain attributes are being equated with white supremacy culture or cultural whiteness. And I mean, I don't know Tima Okun's personal beliefs, but that what she's written about white supremacy culture is bigoted. It's based on a lot of actually anti-Black stereotypes. So I take issue with her ideology to begin with. I think that there's a lot of bigotry and prejudice in there. But I also think that when you look at, okay, how do you measure that? And then are you saying that things like being on time is upholding white supremacy culture? So we want to instill values where students or employees shouldn't be on time. I think that seeing DEI transform and move in that direction just makes it utter nonsense.
Right, exactly. So do you support what DeSantis is doing in Florida, which is to try to ban DEI bureaucracies in universities?
Not necessarily. Now, banning the bureaucracy and banning, state funds going towards something that seems to actually do more harm than good, I understand that point. But I think it also gets away from what a lot of DEI programs are actually supposed to do. So when I think of DEI programs, I'm have a military family, was a Navy wife for over 20 years. When I think so, working in that capacity, I think about access. So people with disabilities, people that may need some sort of support, they should be included in the workplace and in university. And so what we saw before was DEI initiatives and programs were actually housed under human resources or under EEOC offices, because those are the things that they actually were supposed to address. How they've transformed now to where it's its own industry, I understand the idea, and support for getting rid of that, because having that type of corrosive ideology then impact things from curriculum to mandatory training to diversity statements that are required, which is compelled speech, go against the ideas that I think most people that live in, our democratic republic would support.
Yeah, I'm going to take a question from Claire Diane. White supremacy is used very casually these days. How is it defined? It used to be that white supremacy were the people who walked around with tiki torches around synagogues yelling Jews would not replace us, or people with white hoods on and burning crosses. Those were white supremacists. But obviously the term has been expanded, shall we say. How has it been expanded?
I think that you mentioned Tima Okun's definition in her manifesto about how she defines white supremacy culture as leading a lot of people to define it in that way, where attributes like fidelity to the written word and being on timeliness and professionalism are attributed to white supremacy culture, which again is bigoted against not just white people, but it's bigoted towards non-white people to think that non-white people have never valued things like being on time or the written word.
Sure. The other thing about it, I think that there's a less aggressive use of white supremacy that's still plenty aggressive. In other words, it says that American society or Western societies have pervasive systems of oppression that you could call white supremacy, that it really exists in every nook and cranny of society. And so they've taken a word that we associated once with a really extreme racist behavior and are saying that now that it's sort of ingrained into the very structures of society. I think that's what they mean by white supremacy. And Tima Okun takes it to the next level, which says that the dominant culture itself is white supremacist. So you said not necessarily you wouldn't ban it. Now, it seems to me that you're saying that there are some critical functions of what we used to associate with diversity and inclusion that universities still need to do, but could they do them in other ways? Could they be done through, let's say, the human resource department? I mean, I think we would agree that people that with disabilities require certain accommodations in the university, right? And so does that need to be done through a big DEI bureaucracy with 50 or 200 employees, as we've seen in a lot of places?
Again, not necessarily. That doesn't mean I don't think that it has to be done that way. However, I also don't think that just putting it under human resources is necessarily the answer. And I think in order to get to the answer, we'd have to actually evaluate what these DEI bureaucracies are doing. Now, in the case of Governor DeSantis, maybe, the state of Florida has evaluated how they function in the university and decided this isn't functioning in a way that we want to continue to support financially or politically. But before the same way as before building something, you'd want to evaluate it. I think the same goes for before banning it. There needs to be an evaluation. I do take issue with the idea of an entire discipline now, it seems like, of DEI having more administrators on campus than you have faculty actually teaching students, especially when you consider the cost of university tuition. Yeah, somebody's paying for that, and it's either the state or the student or his or her parents. Right, exactly. So, one question that comes up repeatedly is it constitutional even to do what he's doing? And I tried to look into that some and really did not find a lot of compelling argument that it is unconstitutional to ban DEI. A state government
can go to a state university and say, I'm sorry, this is problematic. Now, the question is there any violation of anybody's First Amendment rights in that? Is it a violation, by the way, of the doctrine of academic freedom? There are some people who would argue that it is actually a violation of academic freedom. But then, to do that means that you're suggesting that DEI itself is protected by academic freedom. In other words, that it's like a professor who's teaching something and giving their own opinion, whereas a DEI bureaucracy is engaged in training, not typical education. It's telling people what to think often. So I don't see how you could put that under the rubric of academic freedom. Now, go ahead.
I want to ask you about that. So, but is it more or less of a violation than to require DEI training where people are compelled to make certain statements?
Yeah. So I think that's a violation of First Amendment very often. It's compelled speech. And I'm sure there's going to be lawsuits that deal with that. There have been already, where people are engaging in, are forced to, repeat what the DEI trainer wants them to say. That
recent one in Missouri, where those teachers, I believe it was 2 teachers actually, were mandated to go to their districts, their K-12 teachers, their districts diversity training, and they had to make, particular statements and sign on to the orthodoxy about white supremacy culture and their own rating, I think either on an oppression scale or a privilege scale. And the judge actually ruled in favor of the district.
Right.
So I wonder what.
You're right. I don't think that's going to stand. I read about that too. I mean, this is a prediction that's going to work its way through the courts, and at some point that's going to get overthrown. But it'll be interesting to watch. So yeah, there are rulings at lower court levels that might go against that thesis, but we shall see. Is it a violation itself of academic freedom? I mean, is a very interesting question. Some of the legislation, I think in Texas and maybe Florida, I have to see in Florida, but in Texas, I'm almost positive it's the case. It comes attached with sort of prohibitions on teaching about diversity and inclusion. And I think that's problematic. In other words, if you're just saying that these DEI bureaucracies are a poor use of state funds, I'm all with you. And let's find other ways to do diversity. Let's find other ways to make sure that people are included that are not in these massive bureaucracies. I'm all for that. But if you're saying that people can't even teach about some of these concepts, then I think you're engaging in a kind of unconstitutional censorship. And so I think that is highly problematic. But, there are people, David Schraub, who's a law professor, who argues that banning DEI itself is a major infringement on academic freedom. But I feel like when he makes that argument, he doesn't take into account that DEI itself is an infringement on academic freedom. DEI itself is stifling of free speech. DEI itself is forcing people to think certain ways. Now, there could be DEI programs that don't do that, but there are very few that do. So I don't know why he thinks on balance, there's going to be less freedom if you ban it than there would be if you let them continue to exist. Because I see no way that those programs are going to be any less coercive than they are.
So is the issue with them that they're mandatory, or is the issue that they exist?
Yeah, well, the thing about DEI programs, they're not just about whether they're mandatory courses, although there clearly are. We talked about the one at George Washington University. It's a mandatory course that's actually taught on it. So, but it's also that they govern certain aspects of how the university operates. So for example, they put out like these statements on microaggressions where students are invited to report other students. And that comes out of DEI offices. So I think they create a culture of coercion in the way that they generally operate. And if that's the case, I see, I would favor banning them in most places. Interestingly, I had a conversation with a very prominent professor at a very prominent university who we were talking about Florida and DeSantis, and he was very critical of a lot of what DeSantis was doing. But I said, well, what about banning DEI bureaucracies? And he looked at me and he looked out of his window at his campus and he says, they can purge my campus of DEI, because he sees it as that threatened to the culture of the campus and a free inquiry in the university. And I think that's the dominant force in a lot of universities.
Yeah, I mean, I've paid attention to it a lot more in K-12 education, because a lot of that guidance comes either directly from particular state boards of education or districts where it's mandatory training. I think in the university level, I get concerned when professors have to make DEI statements. They're compelled to do that, whether it's for, we talked about it before, whether it's to get tenure or whether they have to put them on their syllabi. I don't know. It seems odd, the idea of compelled speech in a free society.
Yeah. I think that's one big ideological purge. It's a way of ensuring that everybody adheres to the religion of anti-racism. It's a way of making sure that conservative academics who are willing to speak their mind can't speak their mind, because if they do, they won't get the position, or they could find their way out of their position, especially if they're not already tenured. So I think that's very dangerous. In this instance, even the organization, the FIRE, has offered up model legislation for states to ban the use of DEI statements in the university. But I think they're hugely problematic. And they're just one expression of how DEI bureaucracies tend to operate on schools. They push policies like that then put a chill on discourse in the campus and already purge the already ideological homogeneous environment on a lot of campuses. I mean, there's so few heterodox thinkers and conservative thinkers on campus as it is in the humanities in particular. Now you're basically adding another guarantee that they're not going to have a hard time getting jobs. And I think that's problematic. The other question though I have for you though is that we've talked a lot about non-coercive, non-ideological DEI, and we know some people who do that work, and I have the utmost respect for what they do. They do diversity in a way that is not trying to impose a specific worldview on people, but maybe help people have conversations, real open conversations. I guess the question is, do we favor that? Do we think that that's a solution to what's going on with these vast DEI bureaucracies? Is that scalable?
I think that in a perfect ideological world, it should be scalable. I think the idea, if we get to the actual root of what diversity means and what inclusion means, I think being able to be in a place where you're hearing an opposing view without this insane idea that it's causing harm to hear somebody talk about something that you may disagree with, then it will be. But in this environment where students are being told and employees are being told that if you hear anything that diverges from your point of view, it's causing you harm, I don't know how scalable real diversity and inclusion programs would be. And I think that's unfortunate, because some of the best corporations and best learning environments and best nonprofits actually have a variety of voices and experiences that are contributing to that's where you get the best ideas.
Yeah, exactly. I remember when I worked in the finance district in Boston, I would walk around during lunch and I would see these bands of mostly white men in Brooks Brothers suits walking together. You could almost always pick out who was the alpha male in the group, and they were all men, generally speaking. So, and I thought, okay, we need a little diversity there, not just because, it's all white or whatever, but because that corporation is going to have a very, very lopsided culture that's likely not to allow multiple points of view. That company is not going to be a place where there's a lot of innovation. I can almost guarantee that. And I think, by the way, you can find in certain nonprofits where you have almost the opposite of maybe only women social workers work there. And again, you're likely to have a very specific, very monolithic culture in places like that. And diversity is very healthy in places like that. And I think that's the kind of thing that diversity done right can help organizations think through. Unfortunately, it's not being done right, in my view. And so when push comes to shove, I would ban diversity bureaucracies in universities. but make sure some of the critical functions existed elsewhere in the university, particularly in human resources departments and in the office of the president and the like. Where do you come down? Agree or disagree?
Disagree.
All right.
Only because my first step wouldn't be to ban them. It would be to require an evaluation. And I think that data is actually is missing. And I think it's important to then have the discussion and debate over whether it makes sense to ban them or whether it makes sense to revamp them or whether it makes sense to keep them as is.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to amend my position because you're so persuasive and say, yeah, I would be all in favor of an interim step before you abandon anything is to evaluate the program and find out what it's doing, interview a lot of people, figure out what the attitudes and curricula and everything else are, what the policies are of the DEI bureaucracy. And then if it's one that we feel is out of line with the goals of a university to be a true open marketplace of ideas, then at that point I would abandon them and find other ways to do that work.
Okay. I just want to say like one more thing. One reason I think that's important is there have been more limited studies, research that shows the types of anti-Semitism that's coming out of DEI programming. And if if you're in charge of a university, I hope that would be something that you would be against. And I think having that data is important to see, okay, wait, we have a DEI program that's supposed to celebrate diversity and bring in inclusion, and it's actually harming this particular group of students and staff and faculty that we have on campus. When you have DEI officers saying things like, well, before I'll help a Jewish student, they have to acknowledge their privilege, and that's actually fueling discrimination. And
Sure.
I think that data is important to have.
Absolutely. All right. Well, I think it's a wrap. Thank you, Brandy. Shabbat shalom, everybody.
Thanks, David. Shabbat shalom.